Let's talk about the UK's national debt, the giant number you see in headlines, always paired with a worried politician. It's meant to make you panic, but the reality is more complicated. Understanding national debt isn't easy, but it matters. It shapes everything from healthcare to pensions. Politicians love to compare it to a household credit card, but that's just wrong. A country's finances are nothing like your personal bank account. We'll break down what the debt really means, where it comes from, and why the panic is often overblown. By the end, that scary number should make a lot more sense. Let's dive in. When you hear the words national debt, it might sound a bit intimidating, or maybe you picture a giant credit card bill that the country has to pay off. But the truth is, national debt isn't quite like the debt you or I might have on a credit card. So what is national debt, really? National debt is the total amount of money the UK government has borrowed over the years and still needs to pay back. It's not a single bill, but a running total that builds up over time as the government manages its finances. The government spends money on all sorts of things that affect our daily lives, like funding the NHS to keep hospitals running, paying for teachers and schools, building roads, and supporting public services. Most of this spending is covered by the taxes we all pay, whether it's income tax, VAT, or other forms of revenue. But sometimes, the government spends more than it collects in taxes. When that happens, it runs what's called a deficit. Think of it as spending a bit more than your paycheck in a month. Over time, these annual deficits add up. The national debt is the sum of all those deficits that haven't been paid off yet. It's like a running tab that gets bigger each year the government spends more than it brings in. To cover these deficits, the government borrows money by selling bonds. These are essentially IOUs that promise to pay back the money with interest. Pension funds, banks, and even foreign governments buy these bonds, seeing them as safe investments. But when experts talk about national debt, they don't just look at the total amount owed. The key metric is the debt to GDP ratio. This ratio helps us understand how big the debt is compared to the size of the UK's economy. GDP, or gross domestic product, is the total value of everything the UK produces in a year: goods, services, and all the economic activity that keeps the country moving. The debt to GDP ratio compares what the country owes to what it earns in a year. It's a bit like comparing your total debts to your annual salary to see if your borrowing is manageable. For example, if you owe £3,000 on your credit card but earn £30,000 a year, that's a manageable level of debt. It's not ideal, but it's not overwhelming either. But if your income jumps to £300,000, that same £3,000 debt becomes almost insignificant. The size of your income changes how you view your debt. Right now, the UK's debt to GDP ratio is about 100%. That means the country's total debt is roughly equal to the value of everything it produces in a year. It sounds dramatic, but it's not unusual for developed economies. Economists and policymakers pay close attention to this ratio because it gives a clearer picture of whether the country's debt is sustainable, rather than just focusing on the headline number. What really matters is whether the UK can afford to service its debt, paying interest and eventually repaying what it owes, without putting too much strain on the economy or cutting essential services. A high debt to GDP ratio can be a warning sign, especially if it keeps rising. But it doesn't automatically mean disaster. Many countries have managed high debt levels for years without crisis. The real issue is whether the economy is stable and growing. If the economy grows, it becomes easier to manage and pay down debt over time. So, the most important question isn't just how big is the debt, but is the debt affordable given the size and health of the economy? That's why investors and policymakers focus on the bigger picture. Context is everything when it comes to national debt. It's not just about the numbers, it's about what those numbers mean for the country's future. As of late 2024, the UK's national debt is about £2.7 trillion. That's a huge number, but remember, it's about 100% of GDP. This is the highest level in over 60 years, but it's not unprecedented. The debt jumped after the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, when the government borrowed heavily to prevent economic collapse. These were emergency measures, not reckless spending. The real issue now is whether the debt is stable and affordable. The scary number reflects crisis response, not mismanagement. The challenge ahead is balancing debt with investment and growth. Britain's history with debt is long and surprisingly comfortable. For centuries, the nation has navigated financial storms, often emerging stronger on the other side. Debt, for Britain, has been less a source of panic and more a tool for managing extraordinary times. After the Napoleonic Wars, government debt soared to over 200% of GDP, a staggering figure by any standard. Yet, this was not the end of Britain's story, but the beginning of a new chapter in economic resilience. Following the devastation of World War II, debt climbed even higher, reaching an astonishing 250% of GDP. The country faced bombed cities, rationing, and the immense cost of rebuilding. Did the country collapse under this weight? No. Instead, the British people adapted, persevered, and looked to the future with hope. The post-war era saw huge public investment, including the creation of the NHS and massive housing projects. Rather than cutting back, the government invested in its people and infrastructure. Over the following decades, debt shrank, not through harsh austerity, but thanks to steady economic growth and moderate inflation, which made old debts easier to manage. By the 1990s, Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio had fallen to just 25%, a level that seemed almost unimaginable after the crises of the past. Then came the 2008 financial crash. The government had to borrow heavily to bail out banks and support the economy, causing debt to surge once again. In just a few years, debt to GDP nearly doubled, ending the era of low debt and reminding everyone how quickly fortunes can change. The COVID-19 pandemic struck next, forcing another round of emergency borrowing to protect lives, jobs, and businesses during unprecedented lockdowns. As a result, debt to GDP now stands at around 100%, a level not seen in decades but one that echoes Britain's past experiences. History shows that debt spikes during crises, but as economies recover, those burdens can shrink. The key is not to fear debt, but to manage it wisely. The real test is what we do next, how we choose to invest, grow, and adapt in the face of new challenges. Growth, not panic or drastic cuts, is what ultimately brings debt down and secures a better future. Britain's story is one of resilience, adaptation, and hope, not disaster. The nation's ability to weather debt crises is a testament to its enduring strength. Is the UK's debt high compared to other rich countries? Not really. Among the G7, Japan leads with a debt-to-GDP ratio over 250%, Italy's at 140%, the US at 123%, France at 110%. The UK sits at about 100%, higher than Germany and Canada but lower than Japan, Italy, the US, and France. We're not an outlier, we're middle of the pack. Every G7 country saw debt surge after the 2008 crash and COVID-19. Investors know this isn't a UK-only problem. The UK is navigating the same challenges as its peers. High debt is a global reality for advanced economies. Context matters more than the headline number. High debt doesn't mean imminent disaster. Japan's debt is sky high, but it borrows mostly from its own citizens and keeps interest rates low. Greece, on the other hand, faced crisis when investors lost faith and borrowing costs soared. The US borrows freely because it issues the world's reserve currency. The UK is in the middle. We borrow in our own currency, and the Bank of England can step in if needed. Crisis comes when markets lose confidence, not just when debt is high. For now, investors still trust the UK. The real risk is political or economic instability, not the debt number itself. The UK situation is serious, but not catastrophic. Stability and credibility are what matter most. When it comes to government debt, there's one crucial factor that quietly determines the fate of entire economies. It's not flashy and it rarely makes headlines, but it's absolutely vital. The real test of debt sustainability, it all comes down to one thing: bond yields, the interest rate the government pays to borrow money from investors. Think of it as the price tag for national borrowing, set by the confidence of the world's financial markets. When bond yields are low, it's a sign that investors trust the government to pay them back. They're willing to lend at a lower rate, believing the country is stable and reliable. But when yields rise, it's a warning sign. Investors are getting nervous, demanding higher returns to compensate for perceived risk. It's like a financial stress test for the country. In 2022, the UK government unveiled a mini-budget that shocked the markets. The proposals were seen as reckless, and confidence evaporated almost overnight. Bond yields spiked dramatically, threatening financial stability, until the Bank of England stepped in with emergency measures to calm the panic and restore order. Today, UK bond yields are higher than they were a few years ago, reflecting a new era of higher interest rates and tighter financial conditions. But this isn't just a UK story. Bond yields have risen across all major economies like the US and Germany because global interest rates are climbing everywhere. Central banks around the world have raised rates to fight inflation, and that's pushed up borrowing costs for governments, businesses, and households alike. This year, the UK government will spend over £100 billion just on interest payments. That's a huge sum, but for now it's still within manageable limits, thanks to stable investor confidence. As long as bond yields remain steady, the government can service its debt without major problems. Stability is the key to sustainability. The real danger comes if there's a sudden loss of market confidence. If investors panic, yields can spike rapidly, making borrowing much more expensive and triggering a crisis. That's why governments go to great lengths to appear fiscally responsible, balancing budgets, making tough choices, and reassuring the markets at every turn. In many ways, it's a performance for global investors, who are always watching and judging whether a country is a safe bet. The bottom line? As long as bond yields are stable, there's no immediate crisis. It's the best signal that the system is working as it should. So if you want to know whether government debt is a problem, don't just look at the total amount. Watch the yields. They tell the real story. The deficit is the annual gap between government spending and tax income. During COVID, the deficit soared to nearly 15% of GDP, emergency spending at its peak. Now it's fallen to about 4.4% and is projected to drop further. That's a good sign, but challenges remain. An aging population, demands for investment, and resistance to tax rises make balancing the books tough. Both major parties promise to get debt falling as a share of GDP. The real challenge: cut too much and you hurt growth, spend too much and you risk market confidence. The government must walk a tightrope, reassure investors, fund services, and invest in growth. Squeezing too hard can backfire, as seen after 2010. The debate is about finding the right balance. The deficit is shrinking, but the hard choices are just beginning. The future depends on smart, credible policy. So, is the UK's debt a ticking time bomb? Not quite. It's high and it limits our options, but it's not an immediate crisis. We borrow in our own currency and investors still trust us. Our debt is in line with other major economies. The real story is about tough choices, not doom. Growth is the best way to reduce the debt burden. We need a balanced fiscal plan. Control the deficit, but invest in the future. Don't fall for panic headlines. Ask how we compare to history and our peers. The challenge is serious but manageable. The answers are more hopeful and more complicated than the headlines suggest.